Overwhelmingly, research indicates that 54 to 94% of autistic individuals will develop a mental health condition in their lifetime or experience mental health symptoms. So chances are that if you are providing services and supports to autistic individuals, the individuals that you're working with will most likely, at some point in their lifetime, experience symptoms of a mental health diagnosis. Welcome to Action Insights, the intersection of ABA and mental health. My name is Nikki Dione. I am a licensed mental health clinician in the state of New Hampshire. I've been practicing in the field of mental health since 2006, and I've been a board certified behavior analyst since 2019.
And I am Amelia Delphonse. I am a board certified behavior analyst, and I have been working in the field since 2009. I am the co-founder of Master ABA, and I really enjoy bringing all sorts of different information and having conversations about ABA. And I particularly enjoy working with Nikki. Nikki and I have known each other for many years now. Since before I became certified, we both worked for a community mental health center, and I was working as a team leader for an autism program within the community mental health center, and that program was overseen by a BCBAD. So that was my role, and Nikki was working as a therapist. So a lot of times our clientele kind of intersected, but there was surprisingly little overlap. And I feel like we didn't necessarily do all we could have to address some of the mental health needs of the kids in our program. They were kind of segregated from the rest of the mental health center.
Yep. And what Amy isn't telling you is that, I kind of, forced her to be my friends while we worked together, while we ran a summer program, again, very separate for the, clients that she provided services to and the clients that my team at the time provided services to. And I think it's been a passion and an intentional kind of work for both of us to continue to integrate both mental health and ABA services. And I hope I'm not speaking off for you, Amy, but it's hard to separate out the two of them from each other because as humans, we all experience mental health and physical health, wellness, and not. So, as we kind of go through today, I'm going to provide an invitation to everybody. Because some of this conversation might be uncomfortable, right? If we haven't had training or experience or exposure to information in mental health, or vice versa. If somebody is listening to this podcast who doesn't have a lot of experience in the field of ABA, some of the conversation might seem a little uncomfortable. And, the invitation is to consider answers and resources outside of what we may know to be true or what we have been taught. So while listening today, I kind of like to start a little bit with the idea that we all have physical health. Every human in the world has physical health. And we experience physical health wellness. So some days we feel great, our body's doing what we want it to. And other days we experience physical health challenges, right? Where we may not feel as well, or we may have an injury or something else going in life that, provides some challenges due to physical health. In the same vein, we all have mental health. So some days we experience mental health wellness, and other days we may be experiencing challenges that are related to our mental health. One thing that we're going to talk a little bit about today is how do we start to bring in some of the ideas around private events into the work that we're doing as behaviorists.
Yeah. And one of the things that I know a lot of people struggle with is identifying what is the difference between private events and considering private events and being mentalistic, because that was really driven into me in my master's program that you can't be mentalistic. And I think it's important that we kind of think about what the distinction is between the two of them. So that way we are all coming from a place where it's still supported by ABA and we're not working against our foundations, but we're also considering those private events that our clients are experiencing. So I just want to define mentalistic for everyone. The definition is explaining behavior by referring to inner unobservable mental states or processes. And the focus is on attributes. It attributes behavior to hypothetical constructs that cannot be directly observed or measured. So it involves a lot of circular reasoning. So it might be that somebody explains aggressive behavior by saying he's aggressive because he's angry. Well, if you ask, how do you know he's angry? Somebody might say because he's aggressive. So that's mentalistic reasoning. But if you're thinking about their private events, you're going to attribute the private events, the experiences, to things that they're maybe reporting. So how do you know he's angry because he says he's angry? Or it might be that he's becoming aggressive because he's experiencing physical pain and he can't express that. There's not that circular reasoning when we're just discussing private events. But they're really important because everyone experiences all of the private events. And I feel like over time or maybe previously, we had neglected all of the private events that have been going on for our clients, as though they don't have emotions, they don't have feelings, they don't feel pain, and they should not act out because of those things that are happening inside their body. But I think that one of the big goals of this podcast is to help you bring both worlds together, that we can start to understand those private events that our clients are experiencing and figure out a way to help them.
Right. Yeah. And I think, as you're kind of chatting, like some of the things that are popping into my head, especially around, talking a lot with autistic individuals who have lived experience of ABA services and report feeling as though those services maybe were harmful to them, or, that they felt like the experience in services tried to change who they were as an individual, to kind of like quote unquote normalize behavior to look like everybody else in their classroom. And I talk a lot with the clients that I work with and, some advocates in the field and other mental health providers. And overwhelmingly, I think a big piece of what people report was missing is that kind of individual approach for what somebody might be experiencing privately. Not necessarily that the skill that they were learning wasn't important or being able to engage in their environment in a meaningful way isn't important to them, but also kind of feeling separated from who they are internally, what their private event experience is. And so kind of thinking about how we bridge that gap between what our clients might be experiencing and the services that we're providing is so important, because at the end of the day, none of us got into this field to have our clients say that they felt like we were harming them through the interventions that we were providing. And I think that, we can get in these kind of loops around mentalistic approaches, right? And even Amy and I were talking before we started recording around like, wait, how do we define that again? Right? We had to Amy's like, I had to look back because it's been a while since we've been in school, around like what does it really mean? And it's important to have these definitions and ideas of what we don't want to do within the science of ABA, and really thinking about like what are we doing and how are we, creating checks and balances for us so that we are including the whole person in the services that we're providing. And I just think it's such an important thing to think about as we go forth and provide support and help to the individuals that are coming into our clinics, or we're going into their homes, or coming into our offices, whatever kind of environment we're working in.
Yeah, and I'm sure that everyone listening really cares about actually making a positive difference. And there's been so much criticism of ABA in recent years, and it's definitely warranted. And I'm hoping that it really pushes all of the practitioners towards a more thoughtful approach, so we can change behavior pretty easily. We know that we can. We know that we can manipulate the variables The question then becomes, should we?
Right.
Should we be changing specific behaviors? And um, are the strategies that we're using the best strategies for each individual?
Right. Yeah, and as you're as you're talking, it kind of makes me think back to some of, the I would joke about like old school articles and things that you read, or interacting with people, for me personally, who've been in the field for a very, very long time, and thinking about what the behavior looks like, and then maybe we're working to like eliminate a behavior or extinguish a behavior. And I joke all the time that it's so hard for me to remove my, the mental health cap. And I think I've gotten to a place where like I'm just not going to. Like I can be both, right? A BCBA and a licensed therapist. Even I feel the struggle internally sometimes. But really thinking about, can we start to define private events maybe as like a setting, like thinking about it as setting events, right? Or thinking about the contribution it might have to the behavior that we're seeing. And the big kind of area that I always jump to is around somebody who's engaging in some sort of repetitive behavior that's, not unsafe. So, the vocalizations or stereotypies, the language that we use. And I was talking to somebody I was providing supervision to a while ago, and we were talking about a client that they were working with where this behavior was present, and they were being told that we had to extinguish the behavior. And I always ask people, and I'm going to ask all of you to think about this. Do you sing in the car? Like, and most people will be like, yeah, like I'll sing or hum, or, I have somebody who like will just like randomly kind of tap, pens or pencils. And then my next question is, why do you do that? And so as behaviorists, we might be like, oh, automatic reinforcement, right? Like there's nobody around. I'm singing in the car. It like feels good. So I'm going to keep doing it. However, my question is like the mental health piece is, what is that private event somebody could experiencing? So if we're seeing an increase, right, in stereotypies or vocalizations, could anxiety be something that the person's experiencing, or hunger or pain, or some sort of discomfort? Um, but that's always kind of the piece that I'm living in. So instead of extinguishing a behavior, right, we still want to teach functional behaviors that help people engage in their environment in the best way. And if there's no harm and it's not significantly disruptive to the individual that we're supporting with, and it helps them manage possible anxiety, especially if they can't report it to us, like where do we kind of sit on that? Are we just addressing the behavior, or are we looking at the whole person? And I think that conversation has come up a lot for me, just as a practitioner, as a supervisor, in collaboration with other people in the field.
Yeah. And I mean, I have a story. Years ago, I was working with a little boy, and he was 4 years old, and we were having a really hard time identifying the function of his behavior. And the behavior was a pretty unique behavior. He was the sweetest kid. He had this high pitched kind of Mickey Mouse type of voice. And he was just so sweet to everyone. He had all sorts of friends. He was vocal, and could communicate reasonably well, but he didn't know how to communicate a lot about his private events. He was 4 years old, so that's not uncommon. And we had him in a group setting that was sort of like a classroom environment, but it was within our clinic. And what he would do was attack the staff. And I use the term attack because it looked topographically very different. So he would jump on staff. He would climb chairs and try to claw at their faces. He would hit them, kick them. So topographically, it looked pretty varied, but it was always some sort of physical attack towards a staff person. And we couldn't identify all of the variables that were causing this to happen. So we did a full FA. We actually did it 3 times, and we could not trigger the behavior once. But part of that is that we removed him from the classroom to do the FA because we couldn't control all of the variables inside the classroom. in order to be able to isolate the variables to get the data that we needed during the FA. So we couldn't trigger the behavior even a single time, even though in the classroom it happened multiple times per hour. And so we had to bring him back into the classroom. We did tons and tons of observations, gathered a lot of data. In the end, what we identified was that he's experiencing something internally when and he's responding to that, and it's something in the classroom environment, and we weren't able to isolate all of the things because it wasn't strictly noise. Sometimes it was noise, but other times loud noises would come up and he would be fine. It wasn't specific noises, but he's experiencing something while he's in the classroom that's different than if he's in a one-on-one situation, and it's unpredictable. And I know that we always believe that what we're doing, we can predict behavior. If we can predict the behavior, we can change the behavior. But there was something in the environment, and no matter what we did to change it, and it happened across all different types of group settings. It happened when he went to kindergarten, and he was in the kindergarten classroom. It happened at the clinic. Anytime he was in a group setting is when the behavior would come out. So there's something about being part of a group that was impacting this child's behavior. And if we didn't identify what that was, if we didn't identify that it was something in the environment, we wouldn't have been able to teach him to escape the environment. So we created a social story for him. We taught him to ask to leave the classroom, and he would ask to take a walk, and we would just, if he was starting to feel a certain way, he would ask to take a walk. We'd take a walk, and he'd go back into the classroom and be perfectly fine. But a lot of times we believe we have to know exactly what that trigger is. We have to know exactly what the variable is. But the reality is there's no way for me to be able to identify what he's feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, and it becomes, this is where some of the discomfort is, right? Because it's like it becomes a guessing game. And when we're applying science, like the room for guessing has to be decreased, right? Like we want to know what's happening so that we can provide a most appropriate kind of intervention. On the other hand, unless somebody can specifically say, when this happens, this is what I'm experiencing internally, and this is what, I'm experiencing externally that we can observe, we are left for guessing. And, I'll say a lot, I think, I've said it, you can probably correct me if I'm off, Amy, but like in some of the trainings I've done, like I think I talked about it in the PDA training, like if we assume when we cannot identify the kind of very obvious function of behavior or something or trigger, or we've done the FA and we can't trigger behavior, and the behavior is still, we're still observing it happening in multiple environments. If we assume anxiety, right, we assume that the person is experiencing something aversive as a private event, it does inform how we can start to provide interventions to alleviate or help them, appropriately alleviate that, experience that they're having, even if we can't identify specifically what the person might be thinking or feeling that is contributing to the behavior that we're observing.
And it's so hard for us to go to intervene when we don't know what it is. But there was no harm in teaching him to escape the classroom.
Yeah. Well, and it's still, yeah. Yeah. And it's still, I'm assuming, like decreased the, unsafe behavior or the aggressive behavior that was happening in the classroom, even not knowing specifically what was happening.
It essentially eliminated the behavior. We stopped seeing it altogether because he felt confident in the fact that he could just get out of the classroom whenever he needed to. It's interesting though, because he was never once removed from the classroom for the behavior. So it's not the classic ABC pattern of behavior. It was just his response to whatever he was feeling in that moment. But he was never taken out of the classroom.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I can't say obviously because I don't know this person. But if I live in this place and I assume anxiety, right? And what we have years and years and years of information, not in like kind of the ABA field, but in the field of psychology of what anxiety kind of looks like in the brain and what it does kind of chemically in our body. And it creates an aversive response, right? Anxiety is aversive.
Yeah.
And when we alleviate the thing that is, and from a mental health perspective, when we alleviate the thing that is causing anxiety, we feel immediate relief. The aversive kind of, environment, trigger, person, whatever is removed, and we feel better. And so anxiety does live in kind of an escape contingency if we think about it that way, right? So I'm wondering if even just teaching this child to have some autonomy and be able to request something and have that request met in a reinforcement kind of place allowed for his internal experience to be alleviated. That aversive experience was alleviated, and then he had access to the other things in the environment that we want him to have access to, right? And that's like that bridge that we're kind of talking about is like, how do we start to think about if somebody can tell us, great, right? Then we have the concrete information that somebody is communicating their internal private events and their experience. And if we don't, if I see kind of some possible what I'm assuming might be escape behaviors or whatever it might be, right? And I assume anxiety, then I'm going to teach a skill to alleviate the aversive event that the person is experiencing. And I think that that's kind of where, you know, I don't know, my ABA brain bumps up against sometimes, even though my mental health part of me is kind of like, yeah, that makes like a lot of sense, right?
Yeah. Well, and a lot of people are concerned because what we did was reinforce him escaping.
Mhm.
And so the question becomes if the classroom is aversive and we don't understand what about the classroom is aversive, then how do we isn't his asking to take a walk going to increase to the point where he's not in the classroom at all? And what's interesting is that actually the opposite happened. So at first he asked to take a walk a lot and he was in the classroom only very little. But what happened was over time, he started to feel more comfortable in the classroom because he could control when he was staying in the classroom. And when they have control over it, they feel so much more empowered. And I know that's kind of mentalistic, and I understand that. But when they have control in a situation, then they are more likely to accept being uncomfortable for small periods of time.
Yeah, I think and again, this is more mental health, but I've seen it a lot actually in some of the newer stuff and honestly, like I love reading, Greg Hanley stuff and a lot of his co-authors because it actually is pulling in some of the information that we're talking today, but still staying pretty firm in ABA is that and I'm going to jump into biology for a second, but again, for ABA, like I can't tell what your brain is doing. I can't tell, like what your, kind of cognitive system or your, nervous system is doing in a situation. Again, we have years of research in the medical field that tells us what our bodies do and our brains do when we are feeling aversive experiences. And sometimes it's about tolerance, right? So we work on frustration tolerance, we work on tolerance. I see them in behavior plans all the time, across schools and clinics and ABA, facilities and all the things like those things are built in. And what that is allowing for a private event to, happen is that it decreases the intensity of the aversive experience, which allows for us to access or have room to learn skills, right? So it makes sense to me that this child that you're talking about was able to, over time, have more tolerance for aversive experiences in the classroom. And again, I know I'm like speaking kind of like out here, but it's about again, not that we're going to write when the client is anxious, here's the intervention we're going to do because we won't know that from an observation perspective unless the client tells us. But if I assume that that is what's happening, and I have all of this information in other fields that we can kind of consider to be informative, even if it doesn't design the interventions that we're doing, it allows for me to design interventions that match the needs of that individual client, which I think is where like the importance kind of comes into how we use the information that we have.
Right. And they don't need a diagnosis in order for us to be considering this stuff. A lot of, I mean, the statistic that we used are diagnosed comorbid conditions. But if you think about how your personal experiences are, and I assume that I'm somewhat normal, but maybe I'm not. But I experience very different internal private events through depending on the situation, but also depending on just the day. There are sometimes I live in Tampa, and there are sometimes that I get so anxious when we're in the car that everything makes me startle and jump and suck in a deep breath because the traffic and the people here drive crazy. So there's sometimes that I experience high levels of anxiety when I'm in the car. And there's other times I could be driving the same route with the same amount of traffic and I'm completely calm and I don't experience that anxiety. So I think it's safe to assume anxiety may exist, but it's going to fluctuate and it's going to be different. And especially if they're not diagnosed with one of those conditions.
Yeah. And I think we could sit here and, I think that, we can talk about the most common comorbid diagnoses, right? If I'm going to live in this kind of medical place where like we could talk about ADHD, we can talk about anxiety diagnoses. I know that a lot of the research talks about oppositional defiant disorder, and I will save my soapbox for another podcast maybe on my beliefs around oppositional defiant disorder. So we can talk diagnostically about it, but I think that that's why when we started, I said it's important for us all to think about every single human has physical health, every single human has mental health or emotional health, and we have some days where we have wellness and some days where we have challenges with either or both. It does not mean that we have to meet criteria for a diagnosis, to say that we have anxiety. Like anxiety is kind of it's a common human experience, right? An common human private event experience. When it hits a place where it's significantly impairing our ability to function, then we're talking about diagnosis. But I think it's a good point to bring up because a lot of our clients will come in and we're working with autistic individuals who maybe don't have a mental health diagnosis, right? But that doesn't mean that they might not be experiencing inter or private events that are aversive or are, important to consider as we provide interventions to them. And so I think that's a good point is to, really think about, the people that we're providing support to. Just because the paperwork doesn't state there is a diagnosis, it does not mean that somebody may not be experiencing a day where they're having mental health challenges or physical health challenges. I work a lot with autistic individuals across the lifespan. So I work with people 0 all the way up into adulthood. And at least in my experience, and I think a lot of information shows that a lot of autistic individuals also struggle with other physical health, right? Like gastrointestinal challenges, sleep challenges. I have a lot of clients who experience like migraines. And that can change day to day, which can also influence behavior. Again, we're not going to build that into what we're doing because we don't want to be mentalistic in the loop. But just understanding that that can be something that we consider as we provide support and intervention to the people that we are working with.
Yeah. And as you said earlier, it's an important setting event, just like hunger, your internal state can impact your behavior. And I think that many of the kids that we work with don't have a diagnosis necessarily, but part of that can be that it can be difficult to provide that diagnosis for kids who don't have the ability to communicate their internal states. So if they can't tell you they're feeling anxious, they're not going to get an anxiety disorder diagnosis necessarily. I mean, there are some ways to identify kind of some of their private events, but in large part, once they get an autism diagnosis, their parents are will assume that all of their behaviors and all of their experiences are because they're autistic, not necessarily thinking that there might be additional things going on as well.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, especially if the individuals we're working with can't communicate, right, their private events to us. Sometimes we are left guessing. And I think historically, and at least in conversations I've had with people, like if somebody can't tell us, then we just kind of push it, to the side a little bit. And I guess my call to action maybe for anyone who's listening is even if somebody can't tell us, and we've done all the things that we typically do within, assessing behavior and doing our FBAs and maybe doing an FA, and we're doing interventions and our data isn't showing, the behavior change that we were expecting. Instead of kind of pushing those things aside, it might just be a piece that we start to consider of like kind of the whole picture of the client that we're supporting and working with. And also supporting our parents, right? If we're working with young kids or people who have guardians, like how are we integrating so that our guardians can understand what the setting event might be, which could include private events that we don't have information concretely about, right? That we are just kind of pulling in as maybe a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. And I think that that's a great way to kind of wrap up this episode, our very first episode, um, because I think that it's important for you to consider how you're approaching your clients. So I think if you all could just consider even just one client, what is something that they might be experiencing and how can you approach them in a way that's sensitive and considers those private events? What steps can you take to collaborate with other professionals that are working with them?
Yeah, because even thinking about this, like where I never come from a place that anyone who's listening is not doing any of this, right? So you might be listening and being like, yeah, I do that all the time. And then maybe our call to action is instead of seeing how we kind of pull this into our own work with our clients, when we are working with others, when we're working with parents, when we're working with coworkers, if we're like working with people who maybe we see every day but aren't in the field, like how are we also disseminating this information to the people who are supporting the individuals we're working with? Because then we're all able to kind of consider these setting events that might be contributing to the behavior we're seeing.
I think that's great.
And so we will leave you with this, right? Kind of thinking about the statistics that we talked about around diagnosis, but also our conversation around, everybody kind of experiencing mental health, wellness, and challenges. Remember that behind every behavior is a message. It's a communication about needs, feelings, and ability to cope in that moment. And our job in providing intervention is figuring out a way to integrate all of that into the services that we're providing.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Nikki. This has been fun. And I hope you all enjoyed our conversation and we have many more to come.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.